A modern office worker sits for 9 hours a day, staring at a blue-lit screen to pay for a small piece of land they'll spend 30 years paying off. 10,000 years ago, your ancestor spent a fraction of that time finding food, slept under an open sky, and moved through the world without rent, bosses, or bills. That comparison sounds like a fantasy, but it's rooted in real anthropological research that overturned a story historians told for over a century. Yet somewhere along the way, we gave that freedom up. Not because farming was easier, not because we were too weak to survive in the wild. We walked into a trap so gradual, so invisible, that by the time we noticed there was no way back. To understand what we lost, we need to unpack 3 things. First, how much free time our ancestors actually had, and why that number is more contested than most videos admit. Second, how a single wild grass reshaped human civilization. And third, how that same shift may have rewired the way our minds handle stress. Each layer complicates the last, and the full picture is stranger than the simple version you've probably heard. For most of the 20th century, the standard story was simple. Hunter-gatherer life was, in Thomas Hobbes's famous phrase, nasty, brutish, and short. Agriculture rescued us from constant hunger and unpredictable death. Then, in 1966, anthropologist Marshall Sapiens stood up at the Man the Hunter Symposium and challenged that story head-on. Drawing on field studies of groups like the Juhoansi, San, of the Kalahari, he argued hunter-gatherers weren't scraping by. They were, in his words, the original affluent society. His argument reshaped anthropology. But it also sparked decades of debate that's still ongoing. Some of his numbers have been revised. Some of his conclusions have held up remarkably well. So the real question isn't, was Sapiens right or wrong? It's more interesting than that. What does the evidence actually show about the freedom we traded away, and was it a fair trade? Let's start with the number that started the whole debate. How many hours a day did our ancestors really work? Sapiens' original claim was strikingly narrow. Based on a few weeks of data from the Juhoansi, he estimated they worked around 15 hours a week gathering food. That number went viral, in the pre-internet sense. It got repeated for decades. But later researchers, including anthropologist Richard Lee's own long-term fieldwork, pointed out something important. Sapiens' count only included direct food acquisition. It left out food processing, tool-making, childcare, and travel time. When you add those back in, most estimates land somewhere between 30 and 40 hours a week of total work. Still less than the standard modern workweek once you add commuting, but not the 3 hours a day paradise the popular version claims. What does hold up, though, is something more important than the raw hour count, the texture of that work. It wasn't repetitive or isolated. It was varied, socially embedded, and largely self-directed. You decided when to rest, when to move, and who to work alongside. Compare that to a fixed shift on someone else's schedule, and the difference in autonomy is real, even if the hour totals were closer than the myth suggests. The health data is on firmer ground. Skeletal remains consistently show that late hunter-gatherer populations were taller and had fewer markers of nutritional stress than the early farmers who came after them. Their diets were more varied, dozens of food sources instead of a handful of staple crops, which mattered enormously when one food source failed. If a hunter-gatherer band faced a bad season, they had options. Move, switch food sources, rely on wider social networks. A farmer whose wheat crop failed had far fewer. That flexibility, the freedom to walk away from a bad situation, is the thread that connects everything that came next. Because the moment humans stopped moving, they started trading that freedom for something else entirely. Around 12,000 years ago, in the region we now call the Fertile Crescent, something shifted. Humans began cultivating wild wheat. The conventional framing is that humans domesticated wheat. Historian Yuval Noah Harari, in Sapiens, flips that framing on its head as a thought experiment. From wheat's perspective, it domesticated us. It's a provocative metaphor, not a literal scientific claim. Wheat has no intentions, but the underlying pattern it points to is real and well documented. 12,000 years ago, wild wheat grew in small patches across the Middle East. Today, cultivated wheat covers roughly 220 million hectares of the planet, one of the most successful plants in Earth's history in terms of sheer land occupied and human labor devoted to it. And that labor came at a real physical cost. Skeletal evidence from early farming communities shows a measurable rise in joint stress, spinal compression, and dental problems compared to earlier hunter-gatherer populations, consistent with sustained, repetitive labor like planting, bending, and grinding grain, alongside diets that had become far less varied. There's real nuance here worth naming. Agriculture didn't collapse human health everywhere at once, and its downsides were partly offset by something huge. It could feed far more people per acre than foraging ever could. That trade-off, more people but often lower average health and freedom, is the actual center of the story, not a simple story of decline. When crops failed, though, the consequences were severe. A drought or blight could mean famine for an entire settled population, a risk hunter-gatherers largely avoided by relying on many food sources instead of one or two staple crops. But the physical toll was only part of what agriculture changed. The deeper shift was psychological. In how humans related to time itself, not every group made the trade. For thousands of years, nomadic and agricultural societies coexisted, sometimes uneasily, sometimes in close trade. Groups like the Sentinelese today, or historically many indigenous societies across the Amazon and elsewhere, maintained non-agricultural ways of life for generations, not out of ignorance of farming, but by choice, weighing the trade-offs and choosing differently. But agriculture had one advantage that eventually overwhelmed everything else: population density. An acre of farmland could feed far more people than an acre of wildland, even if those people were, on average, less healthy. More people meant larger settlements, then organized states, then armies and borders. Open land shrank. The option to simply walk away from a bad situation became harder and harder to exercise. And this is where the psychological argument comes in. The part that's more theory than settled fact, but that many researchers find compelling. Anthropologists describe hunter-gatherer economies as immediate return systems. Effort today produces food today. Farming introduced a delayed return system. You plant now and the payoff, or the failure, arrives months later, shaped by forces entirely outside your control, like weather and pests. The hypothesis, explored by researchers in evolutionary psychology and behavioral ecology, is that this shift demanded a new kind of cognitive labor. Constant future planning, resource hoarding, and background vigilance about threats that hadn't happened yet. Our stress response evolved for short bursts. A threat appears, we react, it passes. A delayed return economy asks that system to stay partially activated indefinitely. It's a compelling explanation for something real. Rates of anxiety and chronic stress-related illness are strikingly high in modern, resource-secure societies. But it's worth being honest that this connection is a hypothesis, not a proven causal chain. Plenty of other factors, from social isolation to modern information overload, are also strong candidates. The honest version of this story holds several explanations at once, rather than picking the most cinematic one. We didn't just lose a nomadic lifestyle when we settled down. We built a system of land ownership, surplus, and delayed reward. That makes a full return to that earlier freedom essentially impossible. And the people who eventually understood how to control that surplus discovered something with far darker implications. That controlling the grain meant controlling the population that depended on it. So, was agriculture humanity's greatest triumph, or the beginning of a trade we're still paying for? Let me know what you think in the comments, and subscribe for the next episode. How the first empires turned stored grain into a tool of control over millions of people.